Good morning. My name is Jamlik Omari Johnson, and I'm from Emory University. Before we get started, I'd like to thank the session organizers for the invitation. What is unconscious bias? A primer. These are my disclosures. The objectives of this talk are to define unconscious bias and implicit bias, to establish a shared understanding of different types of unconscious bias, to identify workplace and social examples, and to discuss how to combat unconscious bias. Let's get started. For the purposes of this discussion, unconscious bias and implicit bias are going to be defined similarly, and it's really the stereotypes and attitudes that people unconsciously attribute to another person or group of people, and those impact how we understand and engage with that group or person. These attitudes function on an unconscious level. They can be positive or negative, but they are activated involuntarily because they live deep in the subconscious. Implicit biases are different from the acknowledged biases or concealed biases that we oftentimes think of, and they develop over a lifetime, and they are reinforced by the experiences and the environments that surround us. Let's review the different types of unconscious bias, and we'll use a few workplace and social examples. At this point, you're very familiar with bias related to race, gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, age, ability. But there are a number of other types of biases that may not be as commonly understood, and so we will review those. Affinity bias is a tendency to connect with others who share similar interests or experiences. So dressing, talking, thinking, acting very similar is much more likely to result in a connection with the group than if you don't. Confirmation bias is a tendency to draw conclusions about a situation or person based upon personal beliefs that are not based on merit. So an example in the workplace might be the hiring manager who doesn't hire young female rads because the belief that they will exercise maternity leave and the goal is to have full-time staffing. Attribution bias is a tendency to attribute individual behavior to a group behavior that's usually based in stereotyped observations or interactions. So an example in the workplace might be two employees who show up both late for work, but the tardiness is viewed differently in those situations based upon stereotypes that are held. Conformity bias is a tendency to act with the group rather than allowing for personal beliefs to come through. So this is peer pressure or this is a groupthink. And an example in the workplace might be on a selection committee, there being broad support for a particular applicant, but the dissenting opinion not coming through. This is conformity bias at work. The halo effect is a tendency to view a person favorably after learning something impressive about them. The horn effect is the opposite. So in the halo effect, that positive impression leads to higher equity, better trust, more value, whereas the horn effect lowers that value, lowers the trust. An example might be in the workplace, someone who's done their training at an Ivy League institution versus someone who's gone to community college, a state school, or an online school, despite having accomplished very similar things and very similar CVs or resumes. One way to conceptualize the contrast effect is if I ask you to select the tool that will allow you to cut paper. You may have a preference or a bias for one tool or the other, but in reality, both of these tools will allow you to cut paper. Similarly, if you are doing performance reviews and your first employee is outstanding in every way, and then is followed by an employee who is meeting the standard, there may be an exaggerated response to that second employee because the first employee was so fantastic, despite the fact that both employees have met the standard. Name bias is well documented within the literature, and resumes with traditionally white-sounding names received 50% more callbacks than traditionally black-sounding names, despite identical qualifications. Beauty bias upholds the notion that attractive people are more successful, competent, and qualified. And in research, traditionally attractive men and women do earn more, and there's actually a penalty for non-traditionally attractive employees. They're oftentimes viewed, the attractive employees, as having greater intelligence, greater personalities, and a higher potential for success. Height bias exists and has been well documented. and that taller employees will earn more than shorter employees, regardless of gender, age, or weight. The taller employees are oftentimes seen as more employable, healthier, and more competent. And 58% of male CEOs at major companies are taller than 6 feet. In the last 2 minutes, we will discuss how to combat unconscious bias. It is important to understand that bias can intersect and compound, so multiple types can collide and coexist, and they're not restricted to a single occurrence. So here are some realities of biases. They are pervasive. Everyone has them. They can be implicit or explicit, but they are distinct, and they may actually reinforce one another. They don't necessarily align with your declared beliefs, so you can be a champion of diversity, equity, and inclusion and still have unconscious biases that are harmful or hurtful. There is a tendency to favor in-groups, but in-group bias does exist. The good news is that over time, biases can change, particularly with new experiences or debiasing techniques. And so really what that involves is moving out of the fast, automatic, emotional responses to being much more thoughtful, analytical, and deliberate about our reactions to our environment. A brief note that there are tools that are existing that you can access for free that'll help you get in touch with your implicit bias. So when we think about battling biases, the first step is recognition, also recognizing that it's everywhere, and that the process of undoing it is an active process. So you have to actively unlearn and actively replace the narrative with something else. Within the workplace, there are a number of safeguards that we can apply so that we're not introducing bias into a lot of our processes. So in the last 7 minutes, we've defined unconscious bias, we've provided different examples, and we have recognized the intersectionality and compounding, as well as discussed the beginning steps for battling unconscious bias. Thank you for your attention.
Good evening. This is Nishita Kothari. I'm a professor at Stanford, and I want to thank RSNA for inviting me to this talk. Thought about conscious bias, my mind focused on the fact that gender and race are really demographics that are meant for table 1 of a manuscript. And that the workplace and all that should matter is that I am an IR, and the only difference is I have an XX chromosome as opposed to the X5 chromosome of my colleagues. And with that in mind, I was looking for data and came across this interesting study that both men and women really do want diversity in their faculty, in their students, in their workplace. However, the reality is that the path to the upper echelons of medicine and academic careers, or anything for that matter, is fairly narrow for women. And a lot of the reasons why the theoretical want for diversity doesn't quite translate into is because of unconscious biases. And what activates our biases? Frankly, everything that we do at work, stress, time constraints, need for closure, multitasking especially, we try to find the shortest route, and that's where our biases come into play. And that happens at work all the time. And so the implications of these biases are real in our workforce. This is an experiment that was done. And what it showed is even for medical school applicants, even things like whether it was a rainy day or a sunny day, resulted in biases that came into play. And folks who were interviewed on rainy days had 1% lower chance of getting into medical school compared to those who were interviewed. This is a study we did at Stanford, and in here we compared reviews for female faculty versus male faculty, and then again subdivided into medical specialties and surgical specialties. And as you can see, or what's implied over here, is that women in surgical specialties, i.e. those who did not adhere to gender stereotypes, did the worst amongst all of them. And this has been proved through other studies, is that when women don't adhere to gender stereotypes or men don't adhere to gender stereotypes, there are often real life implications. Gender bias itself is not particular in one particular sex or the other. All of us are complicit. And so when people think that the that women face gender bias by their tall white male colleagues. This is actually untrue. As I mentioned, every one of us has gender bias. And I would even argue to say that some of the worst unconscious biases I've faced have been from other women. And so this is just to be, this is a gender neutral, gender neutral phenomena, if you will. And so what can be done about it? Can we get rid of gender bias? I would argue that I think that's impossible to do so. This is ingrained in our DNA. And so while it may not be possible to get rid of gender bias, what I would strongly suggest is that it is possible to be hyper acute, or be hyper aware of it, and to be able to catch it and nip it in the bud before it actually leads to real life consequences. And this comes both ways. If you're in a rush and if you believe that you're making rush judgments based on somebody's gender, then catch yourself and ask yourself if you are actually being complicit. On the flip side of it, excuse me. So the other pragmatic solution is to use your voice. RBG, of course, was famous for speaking her mind in the most brilliant manner. And so if there's there's one key takeaway you can take from this talk, is to be able to speak up when faced with what you perceive as a gender discrimination or gender bias. One of two situations will likely unfold. Either the person is just unaware, and we all know that a little bit of education can go a long way, or the other option is that it's truly a microaggression. And in that case, nipping it in the bud is probably the best possible option so that you never have to face it again. A secondary thing, or I wouldn't say second, but another thing to keep in mind is context. Context is everything. Tone is everything. And one of the most beautiful things about RBG were her friendships across the ideological spectrum. And so while you may not be completely simpatical with what somebody's saying, it is helpful and often rewarding to keep an open mind and try and understand where they're coming from. So what do you do when you're constantly faced by a colleague who slights you or uses your gender against you, or other microaggressions? This is going to happen at some time in your career, in your lifetime. And in those cases, one of the things I tell my fellows is it really helps to have a thick skin in medicine. It's one of the things, it's a survival instinct, if you will, but really to maintain your sanity, if you don't think you're going to win that argument, it's just best to walk away. You're not going to be able to change everyone. And if it truly is a microaggression or an aggression at that point, we all learned from Harris over the last few days. It's the Harris eye roll. It's to be able to just nip things in the bud by essentially by essentially letting a person know your displeasure, but saying it in a nice, polite manner and walking away. So with that, I thank you for your time. I really do appreciate it. If you haven't had a chance, please take the implicit association test. It's available online, and it really does a brilliant job of highlighting our own unconscious biases. Thank you so much. Stay safe.
Hi, I'm Javier Villanueva-Meyer, and I'm going to speak to you today about unconscious bias and whether or not the minority is spared as part of our special interest session on this topic of unconscious bias. Now, before we get started, I'd like to introduce the concept of system justification theory. So when we think of discrimination and prejudice, we classically think of prejudice as being the precursor to discrimination. System justification theory argues that long-standing oppression can lead to acceptance of negative attitudes towards subordinate groups. That is, discrimination can lead to prejudice. This is due to a motivation to defend, justify, and bolster the societal status quo. or see the way things are as the way they should be. Now, this doesn't speak to people believing that the societal status quo is fair and just. Rather, the system criticism triggers defense of it. As you are all probably very well aware, implicit bias has been extensively studied between races. However, within race, it remains a less explored topic. And so what we'll do today is we'll review some of these more recent literature in the space. One notion we should quickly touch on is that of in-groups versus out-groups. In general, there's a tendency for groups to inflate themselves and sort of cut down the opposing group, even though there may be only an arbitrary division between the two of them. As a result, those in the out-group or the minority can internalize negative feelings toward their own group and lead to a potential state of false consciousness. This was explored sort of in a somewhat high-profile case with this teacher, Jane Elliott, who in the late 60s performed an experiment in her third grade classroom, segregating her students by eye color. If you're not familiar with it, I recommend you just search for it online. You can see some of the raw footage of that experiment, as well as analysis that's pretty interesting. Now, looking at implicit bias within minority groups, this study looked at Jewish American, Asian American, overweight, and low socioeconomic status groups, and found that those were in the higher status groups. Those who were Jewish American and Asian American showed more positive in-group bias than the lower status groups. That would be the overweight and lower SES participants. The lowest status groups showed in-group devaluation, and members of these groups were essentially adopting the perspective of the majority. And the authors concluded that subordinate group members are play an inadvertent role in maintaining the status quo by having this internal sort of unconscious in-group devaluation. Similar sort of findings here, looking at stereotypicality, racial stereotypicality, in an experiment where participants were asked to correctly identify whether or not a man was holding a gun or a neutral object. And the men that were presented to the participants were a darker skin tone black man, a lighter skin tone black man, and a white man. And as these arrows showed, there were less errors for the darker skin tone black man or the higher stereotypical black man versus the lighter skin tone black man and the white man who was holding a gun. And there were greater errors for the darker skin tone black man who was holding a neutral object. And this held true for out-group, which was in this study whites versus, or non-blacks rather, versus the in-group, which are the blacks. And the conclusion here being that an implicit bias does exist within black members. Some further work looking at implicit bias in the Hispanic population. Here, they showed both Hispanic and white women, pictures of Hispanic and white men, and they found that there was an implicit association between a negative association between both white and Hispanic women and Hispanic men. However, maybe it was a little bit less so for Hispanic women, but nonetheless, this negative in-group biases may represent internalized negative stereotypes about their own in-group. Another study looking at facial ethnicity in a mock interview type of experiment found that participants preferred to hire the lighter skin-toned Middle Eastern woman. Interestingly, those participants, study participants who were more ethnic, or who had more ethnic phenotypes, were more likely to discriminate against the darker skin-toned woman with curlier hair And it was thought that this internalized discrimination may result from a product or may be a product of their own lived experiences as non-white persons. This brings up the concept of colorism, which we know there's an inverse relationship between many different factors and darkness of skin tone, and that actually applies across multiple different races and ethnicities. And this contributes to the potential to project internalized prejudices towards others who may appear as they do. And while lighter people may benefit from the aspects of colorism, darker people are unfortunately can be among the ones reinforcing these stigmas. This is an interesting study where students from an African nation were sent to do a study abroad program in a Chinese university. They found that these African students developed an implicit pro-Chinese racial bias within 3 months that actually became a durable response that lasted up to a year. And they also found that intergroup contact quality and friendship and quantity actually was able to predict implicit bias, meaning those African students who integrated in with the Chinese population had lower implicit bias toward or pro-Chinese implicit bias, one could say. So how can we recognize and combat implicit biases? As that last example showed, immersive experiences with racial outgroups can have early and lasting effects on implicit racial bias. If we were to take the system justification theory as sort of truth, then we can suggest that people will be less defensive and more open to new possibilities when changes to the status quo are described as being sort of system sanctioned rather than being against the system. And as we saw, while the minority is not spared from implicit bias, false consciousness may have serious consequences for minorities by preventing them from challenging the social system in which they're subordinates. So we really, I think awareness is the first step in moving forward here. And with that, I want to thank you. My email is here if you have any questions, and I'd like to acknowledge the work of our Diversity and Inclusion Committee as well as our chairman for his support. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Dave Nager. I'm the Director of Radiology at Denver Health, Denver's primary safety net institution, and a professor and vice chair at the University of Colorado. In this segment, we're going to talk about how unconscious bias concepts apply to LGBTQ patients, colleagues, and people. And I thought I would end then with a few minutes with some tips about how to discuss sexual orientation or gender terms, because it can get tricky. As we're learning this session, implicit or unconscious bias are when we have sort of automatic associations with a certain demographic. And of course, the issue is when it is an overall negative or positive association, right? That's actually what implicit association tests tend to evaluate. And the problem, of course, is if the association is a negative one, and then that affects how we interact with a group. So how do we combat this? We're actually going to talk about that later in this session, but universally, people say the first step is to become aware of what is unconscious, so we can then try to address it. Now, I think that's true, but just being aware of a negative association just scratches the surface. The real trick is to say, well, where did these negative associations come from? What is it that triggers someone to have a negative reaction? And the answer is often stereotypes, right, that are associated with a negative value judgment. Now, that is when this starts getting extremely uncomfortable. Talking about stereotypes that may or may not be true are very activating and very uncomfortable. But this is where you start evaluating what it is that affects your viewpoint. So there are some very negative associations or stereotypes for LGBTQ people. I'm going to list some here. It's certainly not accurate. It's not complete, but these are the kinds of things that trigger what ends up being a negative association. There can be stereotypes that the community is overly focused on partying or non-responsible behaviors. There's concerns about association with drug use or unsafe sex practices. For many people, there's an intensely negative reaction to behaving in ways that are not consistent with one's perceived gender or having non-traditional families. So these help inform negative impressions people have. Now, there are opposite stereotypes. There are positive ones, like, oh, this group has stylish or well-traveled people, or they're particularly fun or something. These are all stereotypes. And overall, the problem is having negative associations. So once one does that hard work of saying, what are the stereotypes I might hold? Again, being aware of them is our first step. Now, the classic teaching is the next thing one does is try to replace that stereotype and say it's not true, or here's an opposite stereotype. Now, I actually don't like this strategy for a couple reasons. One is if you try to apply a stereotype to a whole group or the opposite stereotype, inevitably you will be wrong at some point. So take Pete Buttigieg, one of the contenders for the Democratic nominee, a gay man who clearly does not have some of these stereotypes. He has a military background, a long-term relationship from a young age. But he might have other characteristics that are stereotypical, or maybe doesn't have some of the positive stereotypes. No individual can be encapsulated in a group of stereotypes applied to a group. If you try to, it pigeonholes somebody into an area that might not apply, and that really is off-putting. The other reason I don't like this counter-stereotyping concept is because you will actually encounter people who have a stereotypical characteristic. And that doesn't mean the value judgment should come out and that interaction should now be negatively affected. So my take-home message in this short segment about applying these concepts to LGBTQ people is there are, of course, negative overall perceptions, and they do come from more granular negative stereotypes. And it is best if we can approach people as individuals who may or may not have stereotypes and really work to not come with value judgments attached to any of those. Now, I promised to talk about terms to help clear things up. The first one is always try to not make presumptions. If you interact with a patient or a colleague presuming with a question that the person is straight and they are not, this is going to lead to distance. Okay? Now, in the clinical realm, you can ask some factual questions, but I would try to make it very clear it's clinical and only ask if it's relevant. So issues like a chromosomal makeup or interventions that have occurred like hormones or surgeries, or if it is relevant to assessing risk, sexual partners, these can be asked in a clinical way for clinical purposes. The challenging part, even when we interact with people in medicine, is this concept of gender identity. It is certain people's experience that their perceived identity of gender is different than their chromosomal makeup. It is just simply true. Some people feel this way. And if we approach people with a rigid chromosomal definition, it creates distance and inhibits that interaction. So that is my overall recommendation here. When interacting with people that you're meeting in a clinic for the first time, or friends and colleagues, self-identification is so much more important than the underlying biology. So when it comes to gender, this is why we ask for preferred pronouns and how someone self-identifies. And even sexual orientation. It's not about factually who you have sex with, but it's how you identify or choose to identify. The other area that I thought I'd give some tips on is how to handle significant others, for example, join for an appointment. The first or sort of most neutral term you can use is to ask about a significant other. That shows they're important but doesn't define a term. You can then ask for their preferred term. Okay? I will point out it's almost never true that people call their significant other a friend. So I would avoid that. All right, so we've talked about unconscious bias and cleared up some terms. Here are some references. Thank you very much.
My name is Vishal Kumar. Today we will be discussing the role of unconscious bias in recruitment. I have no financial disclosures. The objectives for today's sessions are to review barriers to entry for medical students, to discuss potential microaggressions throughout the application process, and to consider strategies to minimize implicit and explicit bias. Before we begin, the definition of unconscious or implicit bias refers to the prejudice, social stereotypes, or unsupported judgments in favor of or against one thing, person, or group as compared to another. These biases may manifest as microaggressions, verbal or nonverbal everyday actions and behaviors that may arise, which, while unintentional, are nonetheless marginalizing. Over time, the negative cumulative effects of microaggressions contribute to a pervasive state of discrimination and disenfranchisement, which evidence has shown may decrease performance, heighten stress responses, erode recipients' sense of confidence, and perpetuate imposter syndrome. Coined in 1989 by law professor Kimberly Crenshaw, intersectionality is used to describe how race, class, gender identity, sexual orientation, and other individual characteristics intersect and influence one another. In 2010, the AAMC Program Director Survey highlighted the top 5 factors when considering an applicant. Please note that beginning in January 2022, the Federation of State Medical Boards and the National Board of Medical Examiners have announced Step 1 will be reported as pass-fail. Adapted from Dr. Biptu Mangesha's UCSF OB-GYN Grand Rounds on organizational equity, disparities have been proven to be pervasive throughout the admissions process. A 2017 Yale School of Medicine group demonstrated racial bias within MSPE Dean's Letters. In 2019, multiple studies highlighted both gender and racial biases in letter recommendations to surgical residency programs. This has prompted many letter writers to employ gender bias calculators, which may be available on your own institution's GME website. In 2019, bias was also demonstrated towards selection of URM surgical and neurology applicants. In 2011, evidence of discrimination against Black NIH R01 applicants suggested there may not be equal or equitable access to research opportunities, which, mind you, ranked second in the 2010 AAMC Program Director Survey. This has prompted the AAMC to promote and publish a primer on holistic principles in residency selection, which include evaluation of experiences and roles beyond traditional spaces. Holistic review, however, is only one aspect of a recruitment portfolio and may require an overhaul of existing admissions values, policies, and practices. In order to truly understand an applicant, we must acknowledge existing inequities as they pertain to the overall life experience of the applicant. Adapted from the 2016 U.S. Department of Education Primer on Advancing Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in Higher Education, this graphic highlights how inequities in one space, such as family wealth or K-12 experience, may impact an applicant's trajectory or ability to apply. As highlighted in the 2016 Brookings Institute Hamilton Project, the net worth of a typical white family in the United States is 10 times greater than that of a Black family. Redlining, the practice of denying borrowers access to credit based on the location of properties in minority or economically disadvantaged neighborhoods, was widely practiced across the United States. While prohibited under the Fair Housing Act of 1968, its enduring effect is still evident in many U.S. cities. A map of redlining in San Francisco shows the generational ramifications of such institutionally racist policies on education. Notice the distribution of school performance throughout San Francisco, as shown in the corresponding maps on screen right. Some of you may be familiar with the school-to-prison pipeline. Highlighted in this graphic, while making up only 18% of overall student enrollments, 40% of students expelled each year from U.S. schools are Black. 70% of students involved in in-school arrests or referred to law enforcement are Black or Latino. Black students are 3.5 times more likely to be suspended than their white student counterparts. A quick breakdown of application costs revealed potential hurdles for students facing financial hardship. While there is some potential for cost burden alleviation with the implementation of virtual interviews moving forward. According to the 2015 AAMC Current Trends in Medical Education, Asian and white medical student matriculants have less pre-medical education debt. In contrast, Black and Native Hawaiian students have much higher levels of pre-medical school debt. Shown another way, Black and Native Hawaiian students are less likely to enter medical school with zero debt and more likely to enter the school with either $25,000 or up to $50,000 or more in debt. Consider the ramifications of crippling revolving debt as a result of outstanding monthly balances. In 2013, according to the AAMC, the median four-year cost of medical school was approximately $250,000. Coupled with average pre-medical school debt of $170,000, the total cost of attending medical school, including lost wages, is over $800,000. For students with high levels of pre-matriculation debt, consider the uphill battle a residency program of 5, 6, or 7 years may seem. We close with a revelation from Dr. Miller and Pettigrew's UCSF Ground Rounds on recruiting and retaining the African American physician. The 1910 Flexner Report had a devastating effect on historically Black medical universities, of which there are only 4 today. These include Morehouse, Meharry, Howard, and Charles Drew. In 2014, only 515 Black men matriculated to medical school, less than the 541 who did so 36 years ago in 1978. Today, there are 107 historically Black undergraduate universities with over 220,000 students enrolled. These students offer an ample opportunity for targeted medical and radiology outreach. I thank you for your time. I welcome any questions, comments, or concerns to my email shown here. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Ron Aronson. I have been asked to present the concluding remarks for the special session on unconscious bias. I would like to talk about how to recognize and overcome unconscious biases. In the next few minutes, I'm going to talk about these points: how unconscious bias is normal, how the emotional brain can trick us, provide a few examples of unconscious bias that you might not have heard already, talk about how you can identify your biases, such as take the implicit association test, and then briefly mention cognitive illusions, and then about what you can do to overcome your biases. Unconscious biases are learned stereotypes or attitudes, which are really automatic and unintentional. They're normal. Human beings are hardwired to prefer those who resemble us. Research shows that the brain categorizes people by race in less than 100 milliseconds, which is actually 50 milliseconds before determining sex. Unconscious biases are human evolutionary adaptations to help us cope and assimilate. You've heard of the fight or flight response when danger is detected. And it's better to be safe than sorry. Our emotional brain is amazing. We can handle multiple sources of information instantaneously and react very quickly. These are considered time-saving techniques for the human brain. Our perceptive lens enables us to see certain things and miss others, depending on the focus of our unconscious. There's a video on YouTube on selective attention tests by Simons and Chabris that I recommend highly. I'm not going to give you the details of this presentation, but simply to mention that it involves basketball players dressed in white and dressed in black, and you're asked to count the passes between them. It's quite revealing. These 3 examples are ones that I particularly like. Less than 15% of American men are over 6 feet tall. Yet almost 60% of corporate CEOs are over 6 feet tall. Teachers call on boys more often than girls when they raise their hands in school. And typically, white named candidates receive more callbacks for a job rather than highly skilled, typically Black named candidates. Research has shown that interviews are poor predictors of job performance. We tend to hire people that we think are similar to us rather than those who are objectively better at doing a job. Jane Elliott is a teacher who did an experiment on race with her students. She separated the students into the blue eyes versus the brown eyes, and then made suggestions about the superiority of one over the other. It was amazing how quickly the students adopted these biases. But it was also amazing how quickly they can unlearn them. I mentioned the implicit association test. It's a relatively brief test you can take on the internet, but it does give you insight into your own unconscious biases. If you haven't taken it before, I recommend it. I mentioned the cognitive illusions, the tricks that our brain and eyes can play on us. If you look at these two tables, they look very different in their dimensions, yet they're actually the same. And I'm sure you've seen other examples of these kind of illusions in the past. So what can you do about your unconscious bias? First of all, accept that you have them. It's normal. Take the test, as I mentioned, the implicit association test, to help identify your unconscious biases. And then work to overcome your biases, especially related to judging others. Help others to recognize their unconscious biases by pointing them out. Do it nicely. As a leader, it's important to focus on fair treatment and respect rather than discrimination. Look at the positive side of things. It's important to conduct anonymous employee and past employee surveys and listen to what they say. It's important to consider workforce diversity as a competitive advantage and as a business imperative. And lastly, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. I want to thank you for attending this special session on bias, on unconscious bias, and I hope that you found it to be very useful. Thank you.